Welcome, First Church of Christ family and friends, to our online worship service. We're so glad that you're worshiping with us today. Right off the bat, let me just extend a special welcome to any of our first-time guests. If that's you, let us know in the chat box there so we can celebrate with you. Just type in there "first time." And for all of you watching today, please take a minute to click on the connection card tab located at the top of the church online platform and fill out that form so that we know that you were here and how many were worshiping with you in today's service. Or if you're watching the service this morning through the YouTube channel, you can click on the link that's located there in the video description and fill out the form that way. That's such a big help to us and such an encouragement to us. And while you're filling out that form, please share with us any prayer requests that you may have that we can pray with you about throughout the coming week. During these days of this extended COVID-19 pandemic and time of social distancing, it is especially important that we encourage one another and lift one another up in prayer daily. Also, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, we want to encourage you to have your communion elements ready so that you can partake of communion together with us this morning, just a little later in our worship service. And so grab some crackers or some bread and get out some juice. Whatever you've got there at home will work. And be ready for that special time. And right now, as we get ready to sing and worship, why don't you also take a moment to send a text message to somebody and invite them to join us for worship online today. In the message, maybe include the link fcoc.online.church and let them know you would love for them to worship with us this morning. Okay, enough said. We are so excited that you're here. Let's sing and let's worship together.
How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that He should give His only Son and make a wretch His treasure. How great the pain of searing loss, the Father turns His face away, as wounds which mar the chosen one bring many sons to glory. Behold the man upon His cross, my sin upon His shoulders. Ashamed, I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers. It was my sin that held Him there until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished. I will not boast in anything, no gifts, no power, no wisdom, but I will boast in Jesus Christ, His death and resurrection. Why should I gain from His reward? I cannot give an answer, but this I know with all my heart: His wounds have paid my ransom. But this I know with all my heart: His wounds have paid my ransom. spoke a word, you were singing over me. You have been so, so good to me. Before I took a breath, you breathed your life in me. You have been so, so kind to me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. And I couldn't earn it, and I don't deserve it. Still, you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Now that you're full, still your love for me. Yes, you have been so, so good to me. I found my worth, you laid it all for me. You have been so, so kind to me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. And I couldn't earn it, and I don't deserve it. Still, you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of
There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. No wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. No shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. No wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the
lost without hope, with no place to begin. Your love made a way to let mercy come in. When death was arrested and my life began. Ash was redeemed, only beauty remains. My orphan heart was given a name. My mourning grew quiet, my feet rose to dance. When death was arrested and my life began. Oh, your grace so free washes over me. You have made me new, now life begins with you. It's your endless love pouring down on us. You have made us new, now life begins with you. Released from my chains, I'm a prisoner no more. My shame was a ransom he faithfully bore. Canceled my debt and he called me his friend. Yes, when death was arrested and my life began. Yeah, oh, your grace so free washes over me. You have made me new, now life begins with you. It's your endless love pouring down on us. You have made us new, now life begins with you. Our Savior displayed on a criminal's cross. Darkness rejoiced as though heaven had lost. But then Jesus arose, our freedom in. Hey, that's when death was arrested and my life began. Oh, your grace so free washes over me. You have made me new, now life begins with you. It's your endless love pouring down on us. You have made us new, now life begins with you. And we're free, sing it out. Oh, we're free, free, forever we're free. Come join the song of all the redeemed. Yes, we're free, free, forever, amen. When death was arrested, my life sing it out. Oh, we're free, forever we're free. Oh, come join the song of all the redeemed. Yes, we're free, free, forever, amen. When death was arrested, my life began. When death was arrested, my life began. Yes, when death was arrested, my life began.
Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. These words from Psalm 34, verse 8, have been used in the church's communion service since the earliest of days. In her extended meditation on this text, Bonnie Thurston, biblical scholar, professor, and spiritual leader, tells of a grandmother who said that her 3-year-old grandson was interested in crucifixes and depictions of Jesus' death in art. He had so many questions about Jesus' death that his grandmother wondered if it were normal. Bonnie Thurston said that she thought it was unusual, but not really abnormal, because children who've been loved and nurtured can respond with great sensitivity to the sufferings of others. And you know what? This isn't just a 3-year-old's question. You and I can relate to that little boy's concern. Why? The quintessential 2- and 3-year-old question is also our question. Why did Jesus have to suffer and die? And how did the crucifixion erase sin? What kind of God is this? It's outrageous to assert that God died on a Roman cross, an instrument of death, save for non-Roman citizens, insurrectionists, and the most horrible of criminals. The Apostle Paul recognized this when he said in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 23, that the idea of the Messiah being crucified was a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. That phrase stumbling block translates a Greek word which is the source of our English word scandal. It is scandalous to think that the Messiah, the Savior, was crucified. Why the cross? Great theological treatises have been written to answer that question, but there's a simple answer that comes out of human experience and human relationships. As Bonnie Thurston put it, in a broken relationship, only the wronged party can restore the relationship, because only the wronged party can forgive. David recognized this fact. Although he had done irreparable harm to Bathsheba and Uriah, he confessed to God in Psalm 41, "Against you and you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight." You know, we may wrong others and need their forgiveness, but ultimately it is God we have wronged, and only God can forgive. Our sins destroy our relationship with God, and we are helpless to repair it. But God is love, and love seeks reconciliation. As Paul said in Romans chapter 5, verses 8 and 10, God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. While we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son. This is the good news that we receive and that we remember each time we come to this table. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Would you take just a few moments right now to think about the goodness of the Lord as you share in a time of communion together? Faith is a key doctrine within the Christian life. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8 tells us that the sinner is saved by faith. 2 Corinthians 5:7 says that the believer must walk by faith. The Hebrew writer in the 11th chapter, verse 6 says that without faith, it's impossible to please God. In Romans chapter 14, verse 23 reminds us that whenever we do something apart from faith, we sin. And so faith is an important component in our relationship with God. When I was a little kid, I used to love attending children's church, especially when we would start singing those action songs. Those action songs that you could really get into. And there was one in particular that was my favorite. And it was my favorite because you got to clap your hands and you got to stomp your feet and you got to shout, "Amen." That's my kind of song. Some churches would sing, "If you're happy and you know it." Other churches would sing, "If you're saved and you know it." And it was an enjoyable song. But there was a phrase at the end of the chorus that would sometimes get lost in the midst of all the clapping and all the stomping and all the shouting. Do you remember what that phrase was? It went something like this: "If you're saved and you know it, then your life will surely show it." You remember that phrase? You see, it's a lot more fun to clap and to stomp and to shout than it is to be reminded that as Christians, we are expected to walk the walk and not just talk the talk. We would much rather be entertained and inspired than challenged to service. But don't forget the difficult challenge, which is heeding those words and making certain that your life surely shows it, that your actions reflect that joy which comes from having a saving faith. We think that our Christian life is represented by a $10,000 bill, and that we pompously and flamboyantly come down before the altar of God and we say, "I'm yours, Lord, here it is." And we place our $10,000 bill on the altar and we give it back to God and we go out in a blaze of glory. But for the most part, that's not what the Christian life is all about. In actuality, it's taking that $10,000 bill and exchanging it at a bank for quarters, and then spending a quarter here and spending a quarter there through acts of love and kindness. And when you're doing that, then your life will surely show it. That's what James is saying to us here in James chapter 2. If we have a genuine faith, then our works will be visible. Now, some of you are already thinking, "Oh no, here we go again, another lesson on faith." Boy, you think that these guys could come up with something new. 30 minutes of back-to-back boring basics of the Bible. Well, hold on there for just a second. You may not know everything about this creature called faith. There just might be some things that you're not aware of. It's sort of like the little lady who was tired of every November having her husband go off deer hunting. She was sick and tired of always being left behind. And so finally she said, "Honey, I think I can do anything that you can do. And I know just as much about deer hunting as you do. So why don't you take me out with you this year?" Well, sure enough, he agreed and he took her out with him. They both got into separate tree stands on opposite sides of the field. And after about an hour of waiting, the husband all of a sudden heard a gunshot. Bang! And so he climbed down from his tree stand, went walking across the field, and sure enough, there was his wife standing next to an animal carcass. And she had the shotgun leveled right between the eyes of a man. The guy had his hands up in the air and he said, okay, lady, it's your deer, but can I get my saddle off of it?" Well, when it comes to the topic of faith, you may not know everything. You may not even recognize it in all its disguises. And so I would simply ask that you listen with an open mind and allow the Lord to speak to you this morning. A genuine faith is to produce good works. And if it doesn't, then we should question whether or not our faith truly is genuine. This passage from James that we're studying today has received more attention in books and in debates than probably any other passage in the book of James. For years, people have been involved in big theological debate. Some people think there's a contradiction between what Paul believes about faith and salvation and what James thinks about works and salvation. For instance, Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8 and 9 say, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." And yet James says in chapter 2, verse 24, you see that a person is justified by what he does and not by faith alone. Now, as I see it, what Paul is saying is that faith is the root, that it's the starting place. And then after you've given your life to the Lord, faith is the root, but works are the fruit. And so James concentrates upon the fruits of our labors, the fruit of our faith. James is writing to Christians who've been saved for some time, where almost all of Paul's writings were to people who were just becoming Christians. And James says here in James chapter 2, verse 14, what good is it, my brothers, if a man claims to have faith but has no deeds? And so with that as a foundation, let's spend the rest of our time studying 4 different characteristics of a genuine faith. To begin with, faith is not indifferent, but involved. James says here in verses 15 and 16, suppose a brother or sister is without clothes or daily food. If one of you says to him, go, I wish you well, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about his physical needs, what good is it? We might paraphrase this situation by saying, if you say you believe like you should, then why do you behave like you shouldn't? And that's a fair and valid question. Now, James is writing to certain groups of people within this letter. First, we notice that the people he's writing to are the Christian community, brothers and sisters in the Lord. Now, there are a lot of other verses in the Bible which tell us how we need to be kind and compassionate to those who are unsaved. The early New Testament church had a faith that was involved in others' lives. And the book of Acts shows that they were so servant-minded that they influenced an entire culture for the cause of Christ. And even now, non-Christians notice the difference among Christians. Even back in the first century, the differences in the stark contrast between a person of the world and a person of the way was so appalling to those outside of the faith, they just couldn't believe the drastic change in people's lives. The Roman Emperor Hadrian said this back in the first century in describing Christians. He said they love one another. They never fail to help the widows. They save orphans from those who would hurt them. If they have something, then they give freely to the man who has nothing. If they see a stranger, they take him home. And they are happy as though he were a real brother. And so James is first addressing a Christian community. But secondly, James is talking about reaching out to those who are part of a needy community. Those people who lack the basics of food and clothing and shelter. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 25 that whatever you do for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you do it for me. And so that means that we need to have a faith that gets involved in the lives of others. George Bernard Shaw said, the worst sin towards our fellow creatures is not to hate them, but to be indifferent to them. And contrary to popular opinion, the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is apathy or indifference. And James says, listen, if you have a faith, that faith will be backed up by your actions, how you treat other people or get involved in their lives. I heard the story of 2 guys who were talking. One man said to the other, all the world's problems can be reduced to only 2 things, ignorance and apathy. What do you think of that? And his buddy said, well, I don't know and I don't care. Well, do you want to hurt somebody deeply? Any psychologist will tell you that to ignore or disregard someone causes much worse damage than anything you could say to them. Being unwanted and uncared for may be the greatest poverty of all. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 32, Jesus said, whoever acknowledges me before men, I will also acknowledge him before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I will deny him before my Father in heaven. And that word deny there is an interesting one. It could literally be translated not just to deny Christ, but to ignore him, to disown him, to reject him. What it really means is to be indifferent to him. Kipling put it like this: "Oh, England is a garden, and such gardens are not made by saying, 'Oh, how beautiful,' and sitting in the shade." Now, our garden and our property here are attractive, and it's because people get involved. We have people such as the Fishmans or the Heschkes or Kathleen or the Drapers or the Nelsons. The list could go on, who spend hours making sure this building and our grounds look attractive. And there are many other volunteers who work on the inside and the outside of our facility. And the reason that it's attractive for our eyes is because people get involved. They're putting their faith into action. They're putting their faith to work. You see, you'll never grow, you'll never deepen in your faith by sitting on the sidelines. There's a big difference between being a spectator and being a participant. And that's why we need to get involved, because true faith is not indifferent. Don't you love it when someone goes out of their way to do something special for you and to let you know that you're important? They let you know that you're needed. Have you ever had your spouse tell you that they don't feel loved? And some of us have to say, "Well, honey, let me think back here for just a minute. When was the last time I told you I loved you?" "Oh, I know. It was a few days ago. Don't you remember that I thanked you for that great meal that you cooked last week?" And we try to rack our brain to think about the different things we said to our spouse or to our friend. And then they come back and they say, "Yeah, I know you said that. I know that you say that you love me. But right now, I just don't feel very loved." And they walk across the room and they say, "Would you please just hold me?" Most of us have probably heard that from someone at one time or another. And many of us have probably said the same thing to someone else as well. We all need a friend or someone just to listen to us. And when somebody says something like that to us, it wakes us up. And we try to make a concerted effort to improve and do those things which express genuine love. Maybe it's a card. Maybe it's flowers. Maybe it's a phone call. Maybe it's just sitting down and having a fun conversation and really listening to one another. But I wonder if we have ever turned a deaf ear in the direction of God and ignored or neglected and rejected His voice when He says, "You say that you love me, but you don't ever read my word. You don't read the love letters that I sent to you in the Bible. You say that you love me, but you won't even talk to me every day." James 2:17 says, "In the same way, faith by itself, if it's not accompanied by actions, is dead." And that leads us to the second characteristic, that faith is not independent, it's a partnership. Now, don't get me wrong, being independent isn't all bad. Kids can't wait for their independence. Kids can't wait until the day when they can buy their own clothes and when they can pay their own car insurance and when they can put themselves through college on their own and when they can cook their own meals and when they can do their own laundry. Well, anyhow, they can't wait for their independence. John Calvin wrote, "It's a faith alone that justifies. But faith that justifies can never be alone." You see, faith is not independent. It's a partnership with God. There's a partnership. Our service is prompted from our relationship with Christ. It's as if we're working together with the Lord. Colossians 3 verse 23 says, "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for men." These days, everyone serves for the right reasons. Faith without works is incomplete. But the converse is just as incomplete and probably just as common. Works, but no faith. You see, it takes both. A few years ago, while sitting in a courtroom with a friend who was in need of some moral support, I learned of a case taking place in the very next courtroom that I'll never forget. There was a man who had taken an early retirement, and some days in his spare time he would go and visit the residents of a particular nursing home. And people thought that he was just this wonderfully nice old man. Until one day a nurse came into the room of an 80-year-old woman, an Alzheimer's patient. And this man was trying to take advantage of her sexually. And the police came, and they were only able to charge him with indecent exposure. Well, on this particular morning, they were to sentence this man in that next courtroom. And the judge was firm. She said, "You are a sick old man who needs counseling. Your actions are inexcusable, and for you to choose your prey as your prey, a helpless elderly woman, is the height of all cruelty." And then she read his punishment, and she listed a number of restrictions and agreements that he would have to adhere to. And finally she said, "I also sentence you to spend the next 30 days in the county jail." And I'll never forget the first words out of that man's mouth that day. He said, "Your Honor, I can't do that. I'm supposed to serve in my church this weekend." And there was just this loud, audible gasp throughout the courtroom. People couldn't believe their ears. It is sickening to see works without faith. We hear something like that and we question, how could someone be involved in the church and do all the right things for other people to see, and yet on the inside their heart is so very far from God? On the outside, he appears to be a servant doing good deeds, but in actuality, there's no partnership with Jesus Christ. That's service for selfish reasons. You see, true Christianity begins from the inside and then radiates outward. And then the third characteristic that I want us to look at today is that faith is not invisible. True faith should be on display. Now you say, now wait a second. We're not supposed to be arrogant. We're not supposed to call attention to ourselves. But that's not what James is talking about. James means that we are to be proud of our faith. We want others to know that Jesus Christ is real to us. And you say, well, that's just not my style. That's just not my temperament. Maybe that's fine for you, Pastor David, but that's just not for me. Or maybe you're a secret service saint. Chuck Swindoll calls them Clairol Christians, for only your heavenly Father knows. James 2 verse 18 says, "But someone will say, 'You have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by what I do.'" And we all know people like that. People who say they've got enough faith to get them to heaven, but then they don't even have enough faith to get them to church. There's something wrong. And so James says it's challenge time. It's time to put up or shut up. And back in the 14th verse, I like the way James words the phrase. He says, if a man claims to have faith. Notice that he doesn't say if a man has faith, but James says if a man claims to have faith. We like to say a lot of things, but it becomes harder when it comes to actually backing them up. Dr. Evan O'Neill Kane, chief surgeon of the Kane Summit Hospital in New York, had been a surgeon for almost 4 decades, and he was fascinated by the possibility of the use of local anesthetics in areas that had always used general anesthetic. He was concerned about the dangers of what he considered the overuse of general anesthesia, and he wanted to find an appendectomy candidate who would be willing to undergo the procedure with only local anesthesia. Well, since Dr. Kane performed nearly 4,000 such operations, he was confident that this would be a good type of operation to do this with this kind of approach. But it was tough to find someone who was willing to stay awake through such an operation. Well, finally, Dr. Kane found a willing candidate. And on February 15th, he wheeled in the patient, prepped him, and prepared him for the operation. The surgeon deftly cut into the patient, found the troublesome appendix, and then took it out without a hitch. The operation was a rousing success, and the patient recovered nicely. The date was 1921, and the patient was none other than Dr. Kane himself. He had succeeded in taking out his own appendix under local anesthetic. Dr. Kane gives new meaning to that expression, physician, heal thyself, don't you think? But you see, there are so many people that claim that they can do things. Oh yeah, I can do that. I can do it. They can talk the talk, but they have a real hard time walking the walk. And James knew his readers pretty well. There are many people who talk about faith, but few who follow through with it. Emerson said, what you are, Emerson said, speaks so loud that I cannot hear what you say. Sometime back, I read a headline which appeared in a Florida newspaper that read, "Healing services canceled." And in the brief article underneath it said, the healing and restoration services that were to be held in 4 local churches this weekend have all been canceled due to the illness of the speaker. Now that's what I call claim without verification. In Titus chapter 1, verse 16, Paul describes a lazy group of supposed Christians called the Cretans. And he says they claim to know God, but by their actions, they deny him. And you see, real faith is something which permeates every aspect of your life. Your priorities, your conversations, your disposition. It's on display for the whole world to take notice of, so that through your example, God will be glorified. The goal is faith and works working together. A faith that is so strong and courageous that the only logical explanation is that you love Jesus so much that you'd be willing to die for him. And in the meantime, you'll spend your time and your energy living for him. Acts chapter 4, verse 13 says, when they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished, and they took note that these men had been with Jesus. You see, not only did people notice their acts of love and kindness, but they saw a boldness. Their faith was not invisible. It was on display. And so ask yourself a question this morning. Ask yourself this question. When people look at me, do they see anything that remotely resembles Jesus? If you have a genuine faith, then I'll bet they see a resemblance to Christ. What a compliment that is. You need to share your faith openly and proudly. A genuine faith allows Christ to change you from the inside out and to influence others. And then the final characteristic of a genuine faith is that faith is not merely intellectual, but it's from the heart. Remember James addressing the Jewish Christians, and their whole background is the law? They are experts at having a knowledge in the head, but the hard part is getting that knowledge into a faith that is within their heart. James 2, verse 19 says, you believe that there is one God. Good. Even the demons believe that and shudder. And the word here that we translate shudder, this is the only time it's used in the entire New Testament. And what it really means is to have the hair on the back of your neck stand up. It would be like when a cat is in a confrontation with a dog and its hair stands straight up because it's so terrified. And James is a little sarcastic here. He says, hey, you believe that there's one God? Big deal. Whoop-de-doo. You just lumped yourself in the same company as the devil's finest. Demons are convinced of the existence of God. And according to Mark 3, verse 11, even the deity of Christ. And whenever a demon would be in the presence of Jesus, they bore witness to the fact that he was the Holy Son of God, and they would submit to the power of Jesus' word. In Mark chapter 5, we find a man that's demon-possessed, and he has a number of demons residing within him. And Jesus commands those demons to leave the man, and he casts them into a herd of pigs, and they obey. And the pigs go running off the side of a cliff, and they sail down through the air into the lake below. Somebody has said that this is the first documented case of swine flu. James chapter 2, verse 24 says, "You see that a person is justified by what he does and not by faith alone." Now, please don't misinterpret this passage in James to mean that through our good deeds and our prayers and through our church involvement, that God owes us heaven in return for our efforts. No, salvation is a gift. Every October I have a birthday, and I normally receive gifts. Now, I've done nothing to deserve them. I had no say in the matter 60 years ago. I am worthy of absolutely no credit for the occasion, and yet I still receive gifts. No strings attached. And salvation is a gift from God. We can't earn it. All we can do is humbly surrender and present ourselves as a candidate for God's grace. If there's anyone listening today that believes or thinks that because you attend this church, or you teach a certain class, or you give generously, or you volunteer in some capacity, that because of those things God is forced to look favorably upon you because you're trying to earn your way into His good graces and favor, if you believe that, then give up. Forget it. It's useless. You're working for the wrong reason, and God doesn't operate like that. He wants to see good works as a result of what's in your heart, not because you want to slip Him or you want Him to slip you 2 free passes to heaven. You and I are sinners, and we can't impress a holy God. It's impossible. We're in rags. He is robed in royalty. We're paupers. He's a king. And we have no hope of heaven until we realize that we are nothing apart from Him. And when we allow Jesus to come into our hearts, and that relationship begins to take root, and the result is the fruits, then those actions, those good works which we want to do, are not in expectation of salvation, but they are in appreciation of that salvation. Sometimes I think we get it backwards. We believe that through the acts we perform, through the things that we do, those big accomplishments, that those things are the things Christ is looking at. And we erroneously think that those are the things that Christ is looking at. That they're the things that we do for God, that those are the things that someday God is going to call to our minds when we stand before Him on the day of judgment. He taught a Sunday school class. Oh, she was a president of the women's fellowship. They went to such and such church. And so many times the recognition that we receive for titles in this world, I think, is the only reward we're going to get for them. I believe God is more concerned with how you treat your neighbor, how you respond in the work environment, who you go out of your way to say a word of encouragement to, how you act when you're in a hotel by yourself and you're miles away from home. We've got it backwards. God is watching how you demonstrate your faith in the small things, which to a selfish and preoccupied society will go completely unnoticed. One of the greatest men that I've ever known and admired, and I talk about him a lot, is my father. Though by this world's standards, my dad never achieved a level of greatness, he spent his living years doing things for others. In particular, he spent many hours, even days, working with one of his granddaughters, Rebecca, who was mentally and physically handicapped. And one of the greatest joys was caring for Becky while her mom and dad both worked, and making her things that would help to make her life a little easier with her disabilities. And in my mind, I can still see people as they watched my dad get Becky in and out of the car so carefully, and as they saw him doing so many things for her. And I think the thought that passed through a lot of the people's minds as they saw him sacrificing for Becky was this: when he could be spending his time climbing to the top, why does he spend his time with somebody who's going to always be at the bottom? But you know what? People like that don't understand that if you're a true Christian with a genuine faith, they don't understand that you descend the ladder to greatness. You don't ascend it. They don't understand that in the kingdom of God, there is no position higher than that of a servant. And though the world can't understand that type of behavior, God can. Because he knows that through those little acts of love that go unrewarded on earth, those are the byproduct of a deep faith in a Christian's life. And someday they will be rewarded in heaven. Has your faith produced good works in your life? At the beginning of this message, I said a genuine faith is to produce genuine works. And if it doesn't, then we should question whether or not it's genuine. And so when was the last time you demonstrated your faith by your works? Are you involved in the hurts and in the needs of those around you? Are you communicating with the Lord to determine what service you can perform together as partners? Is your faith evident or is it hidden? Has the gospel story found a home not only in your head, but in your heart as well? I pray that it has.
The Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. The Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. Amen. 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 The Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. As we receive, we agree. Amen.